One hip down, one to go. They do get painful, don't they? How many of you have had hip replacement out there? None of you? Oh, man. Well, the surgery is a piece of cake. It's the before and the after that it's a little tough. But the arthritis was eating away at the hips. I was born with sockets. Now, this is how man has fallen now, you see. But I was born with hip sockets that were too small for my hips. I had no idea. And finally, they just gave out. So doctor said, it's your turn. So, but one feels good. The other one still bothers me. But we'll get around. I've got 2 trips to Yellowstone to give before we get the other one done. So we'll see how that goes. But tonight I would like to address the subject of the geology of Israel. Now, I understand that I don't know all of you, and there may be some biblical views and some even political views that may not be, we may not share among ourselves. My real goal here tonight is to demonstrate how the Genesis flood and the aftermath really does explain some of the features that we see in Israel. And so I really enjoy being there. I'd like to spend a lot more time there. I've never felt safer in any other country except Canada. And and I would look forward to going back again and just spending a lot more time. But it's a wonderful place if you've never been there. And it's got lots and lots of geology. Now, I'm not going to show you tonight my tour pictures, and I'm not going to show you me getting baptized in the Jordan. I'm not going to do that. But I didn't, but I know some of you are thinking, well, I want to see, where Christ walked. I want to do this. We're not going to look at that tonight. We're going to take a totally different route. So let's just begin tonight by talking, first of all, the country of Israel is really quite small. In relationship to geography, it's a little bit bigger than the state of New Jersey. So they take a lot of Jews in from other parts of the world, and they keep coming, keep building, and they keep building up. And it's a very, very tiny country geographically, but boy, have they done a good job. They kind of modeled their national park system on ours. By the way, if you go there, one thing that you need to be prepared to have with you when you visit their national parks, you need to carry your own toilet paper. They do not provide toilet paper, so don't get caught off guard. A little surprising. You walk into the bathrooms, there's no toilet paper there. No, you bring your own. And so it's a little bit different than our national park system. But they of course, theirs centers more on the archaeology, and they make national parks out of the archaeology of Israel. And but it is the land of limestone. Everything is in Jerusalem is on a code, a city code. If you build there, you must build out of limestone. And what you're looking at is the wall there that surrounds the Temple Mount is the walls that were built during the Crusading period. What I find to be interesting, though, I'm looking at it, took this picture from the Mount of Olives, looking across the Kidron Valley into Jerusalem. And where I'm looking is where Titus set up his catapults. And that's from where he bombed the city before it fell. So all his catapults were lined up along the Mount of Olives there. And they rained down a lot on Jerusalem. But what's interesting here is this area right there, that's New Testament. And there's a lot of archaeology going on there, and they're finding some very interesting stuff. This next picture, even the graves are limestone. You can see all those boxes there on the Mount of Olives. Now, why on the Mount of Olives? Well, there is a belief that the closer you are, that the Messiah will come back and he'll come back on the Mount of Olives and then enter in through the east gate. You see the white arrow there. And the east gate of Jerusalem was boarded up by one of the Muslim rulers because of that fear. So he walled up the eastern gate. And then he had graves put, and that's kind of become a tradition also. There are people buried on the outside of that wall because the Messiah would not, the belief is that the Messiah would not transgress graves in order to get into the city. And of course, he didn't read the part about the earthquake that's to happen that will split the city, either did he. But anyway, on the Mount of Olives, there are about 150,000 tombs. And it costs a lot of money, anywhere from $200,000 to $300,000 to get a tomb on the Mount of Olives. And the belief is that the closer you are to the Messiah when he returns, the better chance you have of ascending with him. So that's the Jewish belief. That's not my belief, but that's why all the graves are there in limestone on the Mount of Olives. This is the western wall. That was a retaining wall built by Herod just below the Temple Mount. It's all of limestone, but the white lines represent the different building periods. You know, Jerusalem went through a very, very rough history. And a lot of what you read in the Bible in the Old Testament just is not like what you see today. Today, Mark Twain in the 1800s, when he visited the city of Jerusalem and the land of Israel, he really thought it was just a God-forsaken place. And I thought it was the ugliest place on earth. And yet the Bible just tells a different story. And I think it's probably because Jerusalem and Israel have gone through so many wars that the land has been denuded of a lot of the trees that were once there. And but in many places, Israel is bringing it back. I'll show you some pictures. I think that'll just kind of shock you as to what they're doing with the land. They're even figuring out how to desalinate the Salt Sea. And that's an amazing thing, because there was something very scary that happened that I'll cover that in a little bit. But anyway, the wall, the western wall, you can see there are 4 different building periods that have gone on there because of the use of 4 different styles of stone. But they're all limestone, and that's, of course, the stone of Israel. These are the Crusader Forts all used hand-tooled rounded limestone balls for their catapulting. This is one of the Crusader Forts at Apollonia, which is north of Tel Aviv, between Tel Aviv and Haifa, so right on the coast there. And Crusader Fort, it's Apollonia in Greek and Arsuf in Hebrew. And they've begun to really excavate a lot of these places and bring to life a lot of things. Then in Tel Aviv is the modern city in Israel. It's a real cosmopolitan place. It's where all the ambassadors live. It's where we stayed when we were there, and it's where we were encouraged to stay. In Jerusalem, they have these 4 quarters in Jerusalem, and you have to be careful because each quarter has its own rules. And you can be walking around in Jerusalem and wander into the wrong quarter. And if you're not dressed appropriately, even in the Orthodox way, then they'll say something to you. So we decided to go ahead and stay. There were places available in Jerusalem, but we decided to stay in Tel Aviv, where most of the heathen stay these days. They all stay in Tel Aviv. But anyway, in Tel Aviv, we lived very close to the Mediterranean coast. We were walking down to the coast one day and ran through one of their parks. And the park had dinosaurs sculpted out of bushes. And so I thought that, of course, that was kind of, I think they did that for my benefit. But anyway, the geology of Israel, the land of limestone. Now, a biblical perspective. What is a biblical perspective on the geology of Israel? Well, it means that we interpret the rocks and landforms differently than do the secular geologists. Now, a lot of people confuse the secular geology call it science with biblical geology, and they call it religion. But that's really, not only is it inappropriate, it's also very incorrect, and it's very misleading. Geology itself is about 20% science and about 80% interpretation. And one of the toughest lessons that I have to teach kids, and by the way, I think it's very critical in this whole evolution creation debate. One of the weakest points, one of the weakest links in this whole debate is an inadequate view of biblical geology from pre-K all the way up into adulthood. We teach our kids earth science maybe one time, maybe twice during their entire schooling, 4th grade, maybe 8th grade. And they remember about 5% of it. And then they get into college and they get brainwashed into thinking a lot of the things that are not true. The age of the earth, other things like this. And consequently, it erodes their faith. And they can hear all the arguments they want about creation evolution. But this is one that has to get, it has to get retooled, I think, for many of us and for many of our kids. This is why I'm devoting the rest of my life to it. I've written 13 textbooks now. We have our lab for geology coming out with it, which is unusual. When was the last time you saw a lab book for geology? You see one for biology, chemistry, physics, but you don't see one for geology. And I think what we need to do is do a better job of training our children to think biblically when it comes to the age of the earth and how it was sculpted, and to see the difference between science and interpretation, science and philosophy. And I don't think we spend enough time distinguishing those two. Those two things are very difficult for me to teach with kids, and I teach a lot of them. That museum of ours in the Lynnwood area, we get now about 800 to 1,000 kids through there each year. And it is very, very difficult to help them see the difference between science and interpretation. Very, very important. What is science and what's interpretation? And so when we talk about a biblical perspective, we mean that we interpret the rocks and the landforms differently. We use a different interpretive framework than do secular geologists. First of all, science, regardless of what can be learned from the rocks, science can only determine the observable, testable, and repeatable. And we have to keep repeating that even to secularists, again and again and again and again. Most of what gets taught in evolutionary geology, biology, and astronomy is not testable, repeatable, and it certainly isn't observable. The Big Bang has never been observable. It's never been testable, and it's never been repeated. It is not science. It is an interpretation, and we must help them see that there's a big difference between science and interpretation. And to cross over and not be aware of it is really a violation, I believe, of science and a violation of philosophy, too. When you don't see the difference between those two, you really ruin the whole perspective of trying to understand the way our earth is and why it looks the way it looks. Very critical. History and philosophy, regardless of what can be learned from the rocks, history is the study of unique past events. So let me ask you, is creation science or history? History, isn't it? It's a unique, unrepeatable event. It is not science. Some of you might be gasp, Well, no, science is simply just observation. It can't determine truth. It cannot determine values. It cannot determine origins. It's very limited in its scope. And so we've got to rely on other things. Everybody has a worldview of some kind. And whether they know it or not, they rely on that worldview to interpret a lot of the things that they see. Now, philosophy is really the interpretation of those events based on one's worldview. Earth science must be separated from Earth history. They are not the same thing. So when you pick up a textbook that says Earth history, a lot of them are titled Earth history, it should not be taught that way. You should study the science and you should study the interpretation. Now, when I teach it, I teach not only the science, but then I teach, okay, here are the two interpretations. Now you can help a child think and reason, but they're not the same thing. Now, why is it important to know that Israel is the land of limestone? Big deal. Some of you would go there and say, you know what, this is boring. This is boring, and it's hot, and it's dusty, and if you're driving, we had to learn this the hard way. When you're driving along, that's what we did. We had another family, we're in a car, and we just kind of drove all over the place. But everything is written in 3 different languages. And depending on which company has the contract to do the road signs, it depends on which language comes first and how it's written, sometimes spelled differently. And so you really have to be on the ball in figuring out where you are, because it's not always according to the map. Well, here's why. Limestone is a chemical sedimentary rock. It's a waterborne rock and water-laid sedimentary rock. In other words, it took lots and lots and lots of water to lay it down. We do not see limestone formations today form according to what we see in the rock record. Those are huge. Some of these, I can take you to a mountain in Montana that, as geologists estimate, is a total from way, way down all the way to the top. It's all limestone. It's one of the Bridger Mountains. 25,000 feet of limestone. Now that's huge. Today we don't see that kind of formation taking place, not according to the rock record. And of course in Israel, one of the things I learned here in this country was the best place to start looking for geology in Israel was just simply stop along the road. So that's what we did. On our way to Haifa, we just pulled off to the road and looked at the road cutout. And we looked through, took a little microscope and looked at some of the grains of the sandstone and limestone. Here's one of the other things we discovered in that road cutout was cross-bedding in limestone near Haifa. Now what is that? Well, that's caused by alternating wave currents. Limestone being a waterborne rock, now you've got this cross-bedding preserved in limestone. Now this, to be preserved in rock like this, had to be laid down very, very quickly and then untouched until it hardened. You see the same thing actually in Zion National Park, only here it's in sandstone. Now, the typical explanation a long time is geologists called these fossilized sand dunes, where the wind currents would pile up sand in one direction, the other direction, and so on. There were 2 problems with it, though. Is number one, you got to figure out how do you petrify a sand dune. It's typically moves around in the wind. There's no way to petrify a sand dune unless it's a sand dune that's formed underwater. The second thing is that I'm a mean little kid still, and so I take my little bottle of hydrochloric acid with me wherever I go. And so I'm curious about sandstone and limestone, and I want to figure something out, which one will respond to acid. Well, obviously anything that has calcium carbonate in it will. And so one of the ways I can tell that sandstone has been laid down in water is to drop a little acid on it. And everywhere I've gone throughout the Columbia or the Colorado Plateau, which includes Zion National Park, it's fizzed, which tells me it's got calcium carbonate in it that helps bind it together. So these are not wind-blown sand dunes at all. Many geologists feel the same. Feel these are waterborne sediments all laid down underwater and then petrified and then exposed. Now, limestone is made of the mineral calcite, can come in all different shapes and colors. Calcite is really what we call a carbonate mineral. It's made up of calcium, carbon, and oxygen. So you see the chemical symbol there, CaCO3. And by the way, kids, if you want to start working on your family of minerals, any chemical formula that has this little combination of carbon and oxygen, you see it there, you can better believe it belongs to the carbonate family of minerals. That's how you tell the mineral families. They're distinguished by chemical formulas. Now, sedimentary rocks cover about 70% of the Earth's surface today. And most of these sedimentary rocks are carbonate rocks. Some of the sedimentary rocks are not, but most are carbonate rocks. And of course, this would be a huge, it could be very well explained by the Genesis flood. 70% of the Earth's surface. Well, we're not talking about local floods here, and we're not talking about advancing seas and retreating seas and so on in different areas of the world, because this is uniform all over the world. And you'll see this in Israel. Now, you might get bored with limestone, looking at limestone, but there are really quite a few differences. I want you to see these. I don't expect you to remember these, but let me just give you a kind of a taste of the differences that there are in Israel. First of all, there's a rock called Tuffet. It's a sedimentary rock thought to be produced by hot springs. And we see this in eastern California when you're driving down, or when you're trying to get up to Yosemite National Park, driving down 397. Everybody wants to get into Yosemite so bad they missed all the volcanic stuff that's going on the eastern side of Yosemite. And one of those things are the volcanoes that are on the east side of Yosemite, and part of that has produced a lot of tufa along the highway. But you see it in Israel as well. There's calciteite, which is also known as cement stone. It's a fine-grained limestone. There's invertebrate and vertebrate coquina. Now, coquina, it's a Spanish word that means shell. So there's going to be a lot of shells that are cemented together. Here's a close-up one from Ashdod near Tel Aviv. That's about as far south as we dare go. We go a little bit further south and you may get into trouble. You're getting closer to an area where you're not too welcome. So that's coquina, just tightly compacted shells that are cemented together, forming a type of limestone. Then there's this one called chalk. Now, you've all heard of chalk, but very few people realize another name for chalk is diatomite, which means that it's made of diatoms. Now, diatoms are very special creatures. They look like little snowflakes almost, and every one of them is different. But look at them. They're tiny little creatures that all are very specially made. They're all designed, and they did live. There are lots of them that live today. They form a lot of the plankton and things in the ocean, and they're a real food source for modern-day fish, as they were in biblical times as well. If any of you have been to England, if you fly over and you fly over the Dover coast, the White Cliffs of Dover, that's all chalk. You imagine the billions and the billions and billions of diatoms that are buried, fossil diatoms that are buried in the chalk there. It's amazing. They're structures. These particular diatoms are calcite structures of their skeletons, and so they're preserved. That's what helps make up the chalk. Now, I don't know if they make that kind of chalk anymore. In fact, I don't even know if chalk is made like this anymore. I think it's made synthetically. Some of you might know, but all we knew as kids, this is one way to drive the teachers nuts. We had real slate blackboards. How many of you remember the old slate blackboards? We all had to go to the board to work our math problems, in front of God and everybody. And so teacher might be working with one student over here, and here's naughty Nurre, takes his chalk and he runs it up the blackboard, the slate. And it creates a horrible screeching sound. And I could just hear in the background, "Patrick, stop it." And the other thing we like to do is take our fingers down the... Yeah, I was a naughty boy when I was in school. Here's some more calcarenite. It's a water transported type of limestone in larger grains. You can see the close-up of it. Then there's common limestone, which is fine grain. This is the typical limestone that is used to build in modern-day Israel. And then there's the oolitic, which means eggstone, limestone. You can see the little bumps on it. Looks like little eggs almost. There is a town in Indiana called Oolitic, Indiana. In fact, if any of you saw Hoosiers It was one of the towns that played in the basketball against Hickoryville, or against Hickory. But Oolitic was a big limestone quarry, and they used to quarry this kind of limestone down there. Indiana's covered with limestone, so is Kansas, Kentucky, Ohio. I mean, it's just Kansas is covered with it. Nebraska, it's all limestone in there, which also tells you about a big catastrophic event that took place at one time in our history. There's calcistylite. It's a little tough to pronounce. Type of limestone made of water-transported silt-sized carbonate grains. Now, this is a little bit coarser than fine-grained limestone. Silt size is kind of the next size up. And then you get into calcareotite or calcareodite, type of limestone made of very large grains cemented together. It almost looks like a type of breccia or conglomerate. And then there's calcrete, or some of you might know it as hardpan. These are hardened layers of limestone in or on soil. You may be familiar with caliche. It's actually comes from ultimately from a Latin word, but it's a type of limestone that forms a crust on various rocks and in climates, arid climates. It's limey cement thought to be produced in conjunction with volcanoes, as in Arizona. You might be asking, well, where are the volcanoes in Israel? And I'll get to that. But in Arizona, you drive all over the state, and Arizona has over 600 volcanoes, and it's covered with limestone. So all of the volcanic basalt that you pick up in Arizona usually has a crust of caliche on it. And it is fluorescent, kind of glows under a fluorescent light. There's a type of limestone that's kind of a mix of sand and limestone called kurkar. It's essentially petrified underwater sand dunes, and because of this mix of sand and limey mud, that it perforates very, very easy by the carbonic acid and so on in the water. Now, this is the type of stone that the Crusaders used. It was in abundance along the coast. They would grind it up and make blocks out of it. So this is the type of block that you'll see pretty much in some of the coastal cities there that were once Crusader strongholds. This is what it looks like up close and personal there. There's another type of limestone called Dolostone, which is a type of limestone made of calcium carbonate and dolomite, the mineral dolomite, which is the magnesium portion. So that formula is written as CaMgCO3. Now again, you see the CO, don't you? So dolomite or dolostone is a carbonate rock, and dolomite would be a carbonate mineral. And there's calcimacrite, which is a type of limestone ooze or mud. And we should be familiar with this one. We have it all over our country too, especially where there are caves, things called karsts. They're area of irregular limestone in which erosion has produced fissures, sinkholes underground, streams, and caverns. Now, how does it do this? Well, what's interesting here is that you're usually taught when you go into a cave, for instance, you see the stalactites dripping, and they'll tell you at a certain rate of drip, this cave, or this formation in this cave is so many years old, because they can take the rate of dripping and they just measure back in time. Well, the problem is that would work if time was consistent all the way back and you rejected the flood. But if you accept the flood, one thing that definitely happened during the flood is the decay of billions and billions of dead things during the flood. And of course, that would produce carbonic acid. And that would initially carve out these huge spaces we know as caves. You can see it if you come on one of our tours to Yellowstone. Many times we'll go to the Lewis and Clark limestone caverns, way up in the mountains, all limestone. In fact, hundreds of square miles of limestone. Got a lot of fossils in it. And you walk into the cave, and some of these have these big openings, and I'll tell you, this is so many hundreds of thousands of years old based on the dripping and so on. But if the flood is introduced, now you have the idea you have is a rapid formation of some of these cavities, and then after the flood, an ongoing dripping. So, but we discount that, and therefore it does change our interpretation. But the flood would have had a lot of dead things floating around in it for a long, long time, and that decay would have produced a lot of acid. Now, here's a picture of me getting my acid out, testing it on some of the limestone on top of Mount Carmel, and yes, it did fizz, so I knew it was limestone. There are 7 geological divisions in Israel. This is how they've divided it up among geologists there. One is the Western Galilee and Mount Carmel area. That'd be further in the north. The Upper Galilee and the Golan, further northeast. The Sea of Galilee and its valleys. Tel Aviv and the Sharon Valley. Jerusalem and its surrounding area. The Central Plain and the Salt Sea, and there's something very interesting you'll find out about the Salt Sea. And one of my personal favorites, the Negev. This is a place where David hid a lot from Saul. And the Negev, though, is a very interesting place. If you start in the northern part of Israel, there's a boundary, a natural boundary in the northernmost part of Israel called Mount Hermon. It's actually, the Israelis have a lot of ski resorts up there, and they do a lot of skiing. But it's actually a cluster of 3 distinct summits. Part of its northern boundary, it forms Israel, and part of it goes into Syria. But here it is when it's snow-covered. You can see there could be some good skiing on that. The highest point in Israel, Mount Hermon, is 7,336 feet, the northernmost boundary of Israel. The mountain further extends into Syria to 9,232 feet. And that forms a natural barrier there. Another very, very interesting mountain we visited, and I wanted to see especially what was on there, was Mount Carmel. It's quite a long mountain near the coast up there, starting around Haifa. And when you drive up, you drive up to Carmel. It's actually translated as God's vineyard. This is where Elijah, of course, challenged the prophets of Baal. It is a limestone mountain, and these are some of the fossils we found fairly quickly up there. There's a gastropod, or a snail, up there on the left, and a sea urchin on the bottom, and a couple of clams or brachiopods on the right there. But it's covered in fossils, and so you have further evidence of once thriving sea life on this planet that was buried in some kind of a catastrophic event. And everywhere you go in Israel, you see signs of this. If you move a little further south, you go on to the Sea of Galilee. That is a very interesting place. It's not only a resort area. The town of Tiberias is where a lot of people from all over the world spend a lot of time there. It's really a resort city. And a lot of the baptisms take place in the Jordan River right outside there. But when I saw the Jordan River, I thought, I'm sure it's changed since the days of John the Baptist. I'm not going to go in there. So I didn't go in there. But the Sea of Galilee, it's got a lot of names to it. It's Israel's really only source of fresh water. And the Jordan River flows into it from the north and then out from the south and down into the Salt Sea. Now, very interesting, on the east side of the Sea of Galilee is what we call the Golan Heights. This is what's known as a planation surface. Planation surfaces are some of the biggest mysteries in secular geology. They can't figure them out. They're one of the 10 top unsolved mysteries. Why would you have a flat surface on an eroded mountain? Why not have the whole thing eroded? Why not show it eroded all the way across, but it's a flat surface with eroded sides. And so they're trying to figure out what two different forces would cause that to happen, and they can't do it. It's a mystery. Well, that's because they've rejected the flood. If you look at the second part of the Genesis flood, the first part, first 150 days, of course, is the filling of the water. The second 170 or 180 days of the flood is really the receding floodwaters. Now, when those receding floodwaters start coming off, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to plane surfaces. And those surfaces were just freshly laid down, so anything that's not hardened yet or less resistant is going to be washed away and deposited someplace downstream. And so you have flat surfaces. Then the channelized area, or the channelized point of the receding part of the flood, is going to cut canyons. It's just a very, very simple concept. But again, because we choose to reject the flood as an interpretive framework, I think we miss a lot of the geology that is probably there. Now, was I there? No. Were you? No. Did anybody see it? No. Noah was in the boat taking care of the animals. I like to think of Noah, even though there was probably a lot of things different about him than me. I mean, being 600 years old. He lived for another 300, and I'm sure he didn't go into retirement after the flood. I think he saw the earth falling apart and continued to preach righteousness. That's what I really think was going on. But I just wonder sometimes whether Noah was a little on the seasick side of spending over a year on the boat and had more attention on taking care of the animals. But today, of course, we see the aftermath of the flood, and we're really interested in the geology. But anyway, here's the important thing. In 1967, Israel went to war with called the Six-Day War. And one of the reasons they did was because Syria would put their cannon on top of the Golan Heights. Now, let me go back to that picture. Now, here we have the Sea of Galilee. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in Israel around the Sea of Galilee. All the vital farming land is around the Sea of Galilee. There's a lot of shipping in the Sea of Galilee, all over the place. And so the cannon would be up on the Golan Heights, and they would pick off these things. And finally, Israel had just had enough, and that's one of the reasons they annexed it, was they had to protect it. Every time they'd get rid of them, they'd put more up there. And that was a big, big, big problem. Regardless of your political views, I would have done the same thing. Protect my home country. And so that's what they did. Now, of course, there's a couple of towns that are built right around the Sea of Galilee on the northern side of it. But it's the lake itself is situated deep in what we call the Jordan Rift Valley, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But because of this rift in the earth, we'll talk about what that means. It's not just a valley. We picture this kind of plush valley that runs down the middle of Israel between Israel and Jordan. It's more than that, and you'll see it here in a little bit. But because of this rift, it's constantly subject to earthquakes. In fact, the famous earthquake during the days of Uzziah took place right around this area because of this rift, because of the remnant of the flood. And it's evidenced by the abundance of basalt lava and other igneous rock that define the geology of the Sea of Galilee region. Two of those cities are mentioned in the Bible, Corazon and Capernaum. Now, I'm standing next to a synagogue that Jesus taught in at Corazon, from the synagogue where Jesus actually taught, and it's made out of basalt lava. That's what that black stone is. They used the local stone to construct their houses or synagogues. It was the most abundant stone up there, so that tells you there's been some volcanic activity. Well, a rift is a giant crack in the earth and would produce some volcanic activity, and we'll get into that here in a little bit. Anyway, one of the things that the curators did with this particular place was they put up a replica of an actual seat of Moses. Jesus talks about the seat of Moses. It's actually the place where the teacher sat and taught the people. And so anybody who sat in that chair carried the authority almost as Moses. He taught from the Word of God, and the people viewed the Word of God as God's authority, and the teacher is carrying a lot of authority. It's amazing that we teachers don't take that to heart more. I am very surprised sometimes at the reaction of a lot in the church that do not take the Word of God as if it's the oracles of God. We treat it as if this is some textbook we can kind of push around and say whatever it wants to say. But we have to realize that when we teach it, we're teaching the very oracles of God. And the seat of Moses reminded me. Now, the real one that was there, of course, is in the Israeli Museum. But they made a cast, and so the cast is lighter color. But the original one is black, and it's made out of basalt. In fact, there is a sign posted there. I don't know if you can read it, but down below it says Corazon was a village. And by the way, it's spelled about 10 different ways. So when you're looking at your map and you're trying to follow the road sign to get to it, you're going to see a list of names. And so you just kind of pick the one that sounds the closest to what you remember from your Bible and take that turn, and you'll arrive at the place. But anyway, Corazon was the one that Jesus, they say the Messiah, which I found to be interesting, cursed. Now, here is the ruins of Corazon right here. Those are all basalt blocks and boulders in the city. Nothing is left standing. They've had to go back in and reconstruct everything. But the foundations of all the houses are still there, and they're all made out of basalt lava. So it's very volcanically, had a very volcanic past at one time. In the city of Capernaum, the city of Peter, there's a synagogue there which Jesus taught in. But when he taught, it was built of basalt. You can see the basalt foundation there. See that dark stone? Now that's my white line. That's not some worker's tape measure, but that's my white line there. But it's the basalt portion that still was there, the foundation. And then in the 4th century, they're called the White Synagogue, was reconstructed out of limestone. So that's built directly on the 1st century basalt foundation. If you're leaving from Haifa and you go directly across to the Sea of Galilee, go east toward the Sea of Galilee, one of the most beautiful drives in all of Israel is through the Jezreel Valley, or the Valley of Jezreel. It's when you see it, you're reminded this could be a washout from either receding stage of the flood or even post-glacial flooding. We'll get into that also in a little bit here, and how maybe the Ice Age has affected, what part the Ice Age after the flood affected Israel. But this drive is, in fact, the final battle in the Scripture is supposed to take place in this valley, the Battle of Armageddon. And it is huge. And when I remember driving into this valley out of Haifa, I was blown away by the size of this valley. It is immense. It is huge, and it stretches just for miles. It's the biggest valley of farmland, almost flat, in all of Israel. And you could see how you could stick a lot of armies in that particular area. I mean, this place is huge. My mouth was dropped open as we were just driving through it. It's very, very pretty. Anyway, you'll see here there are several mountains along that border the Jezreel Valley. One is, of course, Mount Carmel I talked about. There's Mount Tabor, and there's also Mount Gilboa. This is where Saul was killed. But here's the Jezreel Valley. You'll see the highway down there. You can see it on the bottom. But look how massive that thing is. And you're just blown away by the size. And you also see, too, why this was one of the main attack centers for Syria during the 1967 or 1973 war. This was the place that they came down, was through this one. This is the valley they wanted. You can see how lush it is. It's rich, rich farmland. It used to be nothing but malaria swamps. And Israel, when they started to buy the land, from Turkey, they began to turn it into valuable farmland. And today it's one of the richest sources of fruits and vegetables. It goes all over the world. Very, very lush area of the country. This is Mount Tabor. It's what we call a monadnock or an Inselberg. It's an isolated mountain. Looks like a volcano, doesn't it? But it's not. It's not volcanic at all. It's probably a flood relic left over from the receding flood waters. And this is, of course, where Deborah was involved. They defeated Sisera. And the Jezreel Valley also contains Mount Gilboa. This also overlooks the Jezreel Valley. You can see it in the background. And of course, this is where Saul and Jonathan were killed. Now, as you're traveling south, we come to this Jordan Rift. This is one of the most fascinating places in Israel. And it is a rift. A rift is a crack. The United States has one. In fact, it has several, but one of the biggest in the United States is the Mid-Continent Rift. It runs from Michigan across through Lake Superior and down through Minnesota, Iowa, and Kansas. It's about 1,200 miles long, and they estimate about 20,000 feet of basalt lava underneath it. And people in Minnesota are just blown away that they have a big crack under their state. But it's a lot of fun to talk about. But these cracks are not just there by happenstance. I really believe they're part of the big breakup of the fountains of the great deep, Genesis 7:11. Now, here's some of what you'll find as you travel down the Jordan Rift Valley. Some of it's very lush. Others of it begin to show you some of the water that was there at one time. That white stuff you see there it's eroding petrified underwater sand dunes from turbidity currents underneath. Those are essentially underwater landslides. And now it's eroding. But some of the Jordan Rift is filled with these kinds of waterborne formations. Now, the rift, let me show you the size of this thing. The Jordan Rift Valley, or another name geologists use for it, is the East African Rift. It's essentially a huge crack in the earth running from Syria to Africa. It's about 4,000 miles long. It's a big crack in the earth. And if you want to get an idea of what this crack really is, then I'd say sit down with your Bible and read Genesis 7:11 several times, and I think you'll get a good picture. The fountains of the great deep burst open. That's what he's talking about. The earth split in many, many places, and those are visible all over the ocean floor. But they're visible on our continents, too, right in the middle of some of our continents. And they released a lot of volcanic activity and formed a lot of stuff, and Israel was no exception. Here's a topographical view of the Jordan Rift there. It kind of puts things in relief. You see, Jerusalem is the high point on the western side of the Jordan Rift. Now, you see all the verses that talk about going up to Jerusalem. Now you get an idea of what they were talking about. They were going up to Jerusalem. It's a high point. And then the Jordan Valley, you can see, or the Rift Valley, you can see the Sea of Galilee. Up at the top, it's a freshwater, essentially a freshwater lake. And then the Salt Sea. So when you look at Jerusalem there, and then the other interesting thing is that you go from Jerusalem down, and by the way, the trip from Tel Aviv Airport up to Jerusalem is a fascinating drive geologically. And the landscape just changes by every curve you take. But it's a tremendous drive up there if you enjoy viewing the scenery and geology and so on. Watch the drivers. They're just a little bit more wild than anything I've seen in Salt Lake City or in Los Angeles or in Seattle. You really do have to watch. And there, when the light changes, goes from red to yellow to green, you're expected to go on the yellow. And if you don't, there's a lot of horns that are honking at you. So when it changes from red to yellow, you need to go. Otherwise, you'll have a lot of screaming memes on your tail there. But anyway, it's a wonderful drive. But here's the other thing I wanted to point out is this area that runs down to the shore. This is totally different terrain. And there's a couple of explanations that could account for it. One is the receding flood waters, but other things you have going on after the flood. When the glaciers began to melt after the flood, and after this period we call the ice event, it actually raised the sea level so that many of the towns and civilizations that had kind of built up between the flood, the Tower of Babel, and the time the glacier started melting were inundated. And they're finding a lot of these things, they're finding proof of cities and so on. They're actually seeing in a different way because they've rejected the Genesis flood. They're seeing cities and things as relics of Noah's flood. And I think actually what they're seeing are actually remnants of people that built cities along these coasts after the Tower of Babel. And then as the glacier started melting, the sea level rose, and then they had to move inland. And that could also account for a lot of the erosion along the coast of Israel there. Now, a couple of explanations for the geology of Israel. One is what we call the uniformitarian explanation. As plates of the earth moved apart over millions of years, the two continents began to separate, creating this crack, the Jordan Rift, and other cracks and so on are as a result. Another way to say this is small and slow and long ago. That's an easy way to remember it if you can't remember how to spell uniformitarianism or you can't remember what it is. Just remember small and slow and long ago. That was easy, wasn't it? Now, the Catastrophes View would be this. In Genesis 7:11, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, leaving remnants of cracks all over the earth. Now, here's an easy way to remember the Catastrophes View. And that is big and fast and in the recent past. That's easy, isn't it? But you see, they're diametrically opposed to each other. Will we be able to prove one or the other by science? No. No, these are historical events. You see how we have to separate the science. I showed you at the beginning all of the science, the rock that forms the area. But the origin of that rock has to lie with interpretation. And tread lightly, because one view has eternal consequences to it, the other one does not. It's just philosophical view. And so we really have to tread carefully. If we reject the flood, we need to make sure we're rejecting it based on truth. Otherwise, it's a very bad decision. Now, here's a basic biblical interpretive framework that you can use. If you just put the pieces of the major events in the scripture, the first 11 chapters or so, you come up with creation, a 6-day creation, the pre-flood world, which lasted about 1,600 years. None of that is left, by the way. Some people ask me, well, is there any evidence of ancient civilizations that existed before Noah? And I would say, well, if there are, they're under about 30, 40, 50, 60,000 feet of sediment. Because God's view was that his goal was to wipe man off the face of the earth. And I think he did a very effective job of it. So the pre-flood world is only known through biblical revelation. That's all we have of it. And then what Noah passed down through his sons and to their sons. Then you have the period of the flood, which included both those ideas I talked to you about. A period of inundation, and then a period of recession or receding floodwaters. And then you have the post-flood period after that. And you and I are in the post-flood period. That's why we experience earthquakes, because of the remnants of the cracks. The continents are just constantly shifting. They're all cracked up. They're hurting. And that's why we have violent storms out of control. That's why things just don't work right. We're in the post-flood period. That's why glaciers are still melting. It's not because I drive an SUV. It's because we're in the post-flood period. But this would include the event we call the Ice Age, or the ice event. It included a lot of volcanism. In fact, I really believe that on the tail end of the flood is probably where Yellowstone erupted, helping to produce that great ice event. Anyway, that is a interpretive framework you can use anywhere you drive this summer on your tours or wherever you go for vacations. Now, in the Jordan Rift, I want to clear up a real misunderstanding here. This is what people call the Dead Sea. In fact, every translation in your Bible, I bet, that you use calls it the Dead Sea. And it's really not. It's not the Dead Sea at all. In the Bible, if you look at the original language, it's always called the Salt Sea. Nowhere that I can find in the scriptures that ever called the Dead Sea. It's called the Salt Sea. And I think there's good reason for it. The water is actually very, very beneficial. It's not dead at all. It contains bacteria, algae, and many useful minerals. And where Jesus says salt is good, what our culture says is salt is bad. Well, that's because we've stripped it of everything. And so the only thing we're eating is sodium. But it has, if you look at natural salt, it has about 21 different nutrients in it that are actually good for you. Now, here's the way Israel has handled things. All up and down the Salt Sea, and this place is kind of ugly. I mean, and it stinks because of it. I mean, there's nothing else growing there. And you can see the salt builds up very rapidly. It's the saltiest body of water in the world. But look at this. There are resorts built all around the Salt Sea. Now, why would that be? It's a fancy resort. And the reason is because they take advantage of the health benefits. They come there, people from all over the world, they come there to take the mud baths and to soak in the Salt Sea because of the nutrients that it helps in a lot of skin diseases. So it's actually very medicinal and very beneficial. And that's where my eyes were really open to, wow, there's a lot of stuff that goes on here around the Salt Sea. I thought it was just this dead thing that was out in the middle of nowhere, and that was it. But no, it's called the Salt Sea in the Bible for a reason. Now, we did visit Caesarea on the coast there. I got a number of pictures I took and so on, but I'm not going to talk about those. I think I was drawn to the geology of the thing. So, Caesar's arena was in back of me, and I was kind of focused on this formation right here. What are you looking at? People would kind of look at you like you're kind of nuts. This is really folded and bent sandstone, a combination of sandstone, limestone, this Kirkar we talked about earlier, with cross-bedding. You see it there. Now, this had to have been formed and then hardened underwater and very quickly before it was disturbed. Now it's just rock that's preserved the bending and the wave created by the wave action of the sea or of the water that covered it. Rock does not bend. I don't know if you've ever tried to bend rock. It doesn't bend, it breaks. So the only time rock really can bend is if it's somewhat pliable, and that would be in its initial state until it hardens. The other thing about Caesarea is that it's since it was a Roman city, it's actually built by Herod for the Caesar's pleasure, but they imported a lot of granite from different places in the world, and this is one of the pillars of granite. They also imported their marble from various places, primarily from Italy. And they also used pillars from the local Kirkar material. They used to create pillars and so on. But Caesarea is a neat place if you get a chance to see it. The bronze coins for the Caesars were minted in Caesarea, so I had to have a bronze coin of Nero from Caesar. And I did find a good coin dealer I could talk to in Caesarea, and did get one, so that adds to my collection here and memories. I think my favorite part, though, of all of Israel is the southernmost part of Israel, It's the most geologically interesting to me, and that is the Negev Desert. There is so much to see in there. And by the way, this was Ben Gurion's favorite place. His home was there, the library, the university. Everything is situated in the Negev. He loved the Negev. He thought it was the heartland, really, of Israel. And there's just a lot to see there. Much of the history of David took place there. And, of course, the famous Masada is also built on the western or the eastern, western part of the Salt Sea, northern part of the Negev. There you see it. And so as you go into the Negev Desert, one of the things that impresses you right away are the massive numbers of planation surfaces throughout the desert. These have all been scraped clean by the flood at one time, and then, of course, erosion has also set in. But and there are nicely paved highways all through there, so it's a nice drive down and back. You do have to go through the West Bank area, and then from the West Bank into Jerusalem, and as you do, you have to go into the checkpoint there, and that can take a little time, so be prepared for that. Masada was this huge fortress, one of actually 3 big fortresses Herod built, and I think he built them for himself to escape rebellions of the Jewish people. He was not fully Jewish and was not Jewish at heart, and a lot of Jews were very, very angry at him. In consolation, he remodeled what they call the Solomon's Temple. He remodeled it, but he kind of did it in a very worldly way, and then he also built up several structures. One of those was this place called Masada. There you can see the Roman ramp on the one side. And that's pretty impressive. Now, how you get up there, I did not walk it. They have a cable car that goes up, and you can catch the cable car, and then you can walk around on the top, and they have all kinds of things up there. But as you look down from the top, this thing is impressive. Limestone, sandstone. You can see one of the Roman encampments. You see that little square down in those were Roman encampments, and they're still there. They placed a bunch of those around Masada to surround it. And, of course, Masada could last almost indefinitely. It had great, big internal cisterns that held a lot of fresh water, and they could outlast the Romans. The Romans knew that, and they had to figure out something to do, so they built a ramp, and that's how they got in. If you go into the Zen Valley in the Negev Desert, you'll see also planation surfaces and a lot of receding flood remnants. These are almost like wave actions created, and then the flood waters disappeared, leaving these remnants to erode. There's a nice example of what, kids? There you go, you got it. All right, remember those planation surfaces. You'll see them all over the United States. Now, the thing that also caught my attention was this formation, the Maktesh Ramon, or the crater Ramon. It's actually not a crater. Israel calls it the Grand Canyon of Israel. And it is huge. Now, do you see all the little black spots down there? Those are volcanic remnants. You can actually drive down into it and drive around and get out and walk around and look at the different stones and so on that are around these mounds. These are not shadows. Those are volcanic remnants of once erupting volcanoes. And most likely during the flood, as the remnants are all washed away now and a lot of the canyon was carved out, you can kind of get the size of the canyon by looking at the perspective here. We're on the top and looking into the canyon. See a couple of friendly goats there. But you can see the distance. I mean, this canyon is huge. And it's quite impressive. Here's another shot of the Negev. One of the things that we discovered was this formation called a laccolith. What on earth is a laccolith? That means pond stone. And essentially what it is a basalt neck of a volcano that never quite erupted. So as it was erupting under sandstone and never reached the surface. And so it solidified, and then as the floodwaters washed away the sandstone, it left the remnant. Now, you have these in Monument Valley. They're called laccoliths. You've seen these as you've been in Monument Valley. Devil's Tower is another example of a laccolith. It's a volcanic neck that had sediments around it. Floodwaters washed it away, leaving the more resistant lava that had hardened there. And it's still there today. But Israel has those as well. Here's something very impressive. Within the Maktesh Ramon is this thing they call the carpentry shop. It's actually, these are pillars. Some of them are four-sided, some of them are five-sided. And it's essentially metamorphosed sandstone, which would be a type of quartzite. Well, how do you get that? Well, you'd have to have an awful lot of hot water involved. And of course, if you mix the idea of the floodwaters and the volcanism that was going on and the sand that was swirling around in the floodwaters, then you've got the possibility for metamorphism is very, very high, and that's what these are. These are actually quartzite pillars. Not a very hard quartzite, but metamorphosed sandstone. And there you see it in the form of those pillars. Other places in Negev, you can see these basalt columns that have been hardened underneath an overlying cover of limestone. Here's one of the volcanoes inactive right now, or extinct, they'd call it. In the Negev, here's more. One of the most fascinating places in the Maktesh was this, the Ammonite Wall. I want you to look at that now. You see those little kind of round, look like snail little things? These aren't very little, they're huge. They're thousands and thousands of ammonites. In fact, that's just a partial picture of the wall. Here's a greater picture of it. That entire wall, world famous, the Ammonite Wall. Hundreds of thousands of fossil cephalopods buried in what could only be explained as a catastrophic water event. Were all laid down at the same time. These weren't cephalopods that just died one at a time. They were all buried in a graveyard type of an event. Here's a structure that is various sandstone layers. Look what's shooting up right in the middle of it. It's a limestone, what we call a dike in geology, or an intrusion. Now this shows the event had to have happened simultaneously, because the layers on either side of it are not disturbed. Had this come along later, it would have broken up the layers and would have showed signs of it. But this happened in one pretty quick event. Isn't that an interesting formation? The uniformity of layers and the dike would have to have been formed in the same event with no long periods of time in between layers. Now, geologists tend to see the layers as representing different time environments, one right after another. But these would all have been laid down in one quick, rapid event of the flood. So as I close tonight, one of the things I wanted to just touch on a little bit, and a lot of people ask about this, is did the ice event after the flood have any impact on Israel? By the way, we got the so-called Ice Age from this man here, Louis Agassiz. He came to America from Switzerland. He is recognized as the father of modern glaciology. So he taught the Americans about glaciology. Up until that point, many of the scientists were convinced that the deposits they were looking at, and the camp was really split. A lot of deposits they were looking at were flood deposits. And he showed them very quickly stuff that went on in Switzerland, rounded valleys and erratic stones that shouldn't be where they show up. And he began to just talk to him about all of this, and that became one of the arguments against the flood. But it wasn't against the flood, it was against the argument of the people who thought these represented flood sediments. And that was the big problem. No one today disagrees that has seen glacial remnants And one of these we see in the Yellowstone trip in the Beartooth Mountains, this long glacial valley. Many of you have been on this trip with me. Rounded glacial valley, several miles long and about 2,000 feet deep, where a glacier has cut this. Now, they don't have any glaciers, or they have a few in the top of the Beartooth, and they're not very big. They get a lot of snow in the Beartooth, 15 to 20 feet, but it doesn't stay all year. It melts. So there are remnants there. The question is not that it didn't take place, but when did it take place? And he was the first really to recognize and to teach scientifically on the subject of a past ice event. I think it was really interesting, too. He never called it an ice age. Louis Agassiz already referred to it as an ice event. And I've tried to do that more and more when I present this idea. Not call it an ice age. An ice age implies a lot of time involved. And that's, of course, that's what snuck into the uniformitarian view, that we've had several of these big ice ages that have lasted maybe 1 million years or so. But this was a short period of time, rather rapid, catastrophic period following the flood, due to primarily all the volcanism that was going on. And by the way, most scientists of his days were what we called polygenists, which believed that races came from separate creations. Now, they didn't get that from the Bible. You know that, and I know that. So what happens is now that speculation sets in the 1800s, moving away from the biblical view, you can begin to see the biblical view of man moving away. The other thing I think we've made a big mistake on, and this has followed us down into our modern age. We're all familiar with Linnaeus, and he was a believer. He came up with the Linnaeus Classification system. It was an excellent classification system, but he made one big mistake. He grouped man with the animal kingdom. Man is nowhere called an animal in the Bible. Nowhere. Man is a special creation of God, made in the image and likeness of God. When we moved away from that biblical view linked in Genesis, we started to get into all kinds of problems with the definition of marriage, sexuality, and so on. That's where they all spring from. We made mistakes of rejecting the scriptures, and consequently, we've developed our own ideas, and they've led us down wrong paths. So the primary evidence for this ice event, or ice age, is found primarily in these areas of the world. The United States shows a great deal of this. We see this out in our own state, in Washington. This is the main reason you have the San Juan Islands. They're really relics of that period of time when the glaciers began to melt and areas of land were separated from one another. Much of the northern hemisphere, a lot of the southern hemisphere, and the higher latitudes, which of course would have included Mount Hermon. Now, as the glaciers began to build, they took up areas of land that we normally see today as inundated, and they are inundated today in the red. If you look in the red, these were once exposed, and these are where some of these cities are being found. They were areas of land where people could go and settle. This is because the glaciers had primarily incorporated a lot of the water, lowering the sea level. When they began to melt, began to produce drastic flooding, and a lot of the areas of land that we see, one of which is the Bering Strait. It's very shallow, actually, a very shallow area, but it was the one area where animals could go back and forth between Asia and what we are now, the United States, on land at one time. But now it's water, but not very deep, relatively speaking. And that's because as the glaciers melted, then it rose, the water level rose, and produced more catastrophic flooding. The Columbia Flood Plateau out here is an example of it in Washington. And there you can see also Israel would have been affected partly by this. Some of it is in red. And this is why I think you see when you're talking, when you read the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, why did Lot go into Sodom? It says he looked and he saw what? The lush valley before him. Well, today you drive through an area that was once thought to be Sodom and Gomorrah, and you go, man, either Lot was blind or I wouldn't live here. It's all desert. But at one time it was not that way. And in fact, these areas here now are our deserts, these areas in brown. But at one time, these areas were all very, very lush. There's evidence in Saudi Arabia, right in the middle of Saudi Arabia, of civilization that used to live there and thrive there. And I think we're looking at a period between the Tower of Babel and the time of the great advancing dryness and dust and all kinds of things that began to consume the globe. But that's part of the post-flood world we live in. And it's all directly related to the ice, period. Okay, one last thing here. I do make a kit on the Geology of Israel. If you'd like to have one, it's back there. You can order it back at the table. It contains 56 rock, mineral, and fossil samples, 21 of which are from Israel. Yes, I shipped a bunch of stuff back. And since I signed it in shekels, it just blew by me. I didn't want to know the dollar amount. So, but I shipped a bunch of stuff back from Israel and did it all in shekels. And so to me, it was very cheap. 21 from Israel. And it has a full color 99 detailed geology of Israel, a loose leaf book. So if you want to order that, talk to my wife in the back, and she can make that possible for you. So anyway, at that point, I'd like to just end the seminar for tonight. And I don't know if you want to take any time at all here.
Give Patrick a hand for that presentation. He covered a lot of ground, shall we say? So
I left out all the tourist pictures.
Yeah. But anyway, we'll take time for a few questions. And while you think of your question, we're going to take a free will offering to cover some of the expenses of running this ministry. So if you feel comfortable doing that, either through here or through donation, check, cash, whatever. Okay, so let's take a few questions in. If you have a question, put up your hand. I'll come around with the mic because we want to record the question as well as the answer.
Okay, you gave us a little teaser. You said that there are some interesting things going on with the desalination in the Salt Sea.
Yes.
And my son has been waiting ever so patiently for you to get back to that point. So I was wondering if there's anything else you could bring up to us along that line quickly.
Well, I think some of it's very secretive because one of the things that scared Israel was during the 67 wars, part of what brought on the war, was Syria cut off the Jordan River into the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is the only source of drinking water for Israel. And had they been successful with that, Israel would have been left without water. And I think it scared them enough to start working on the idea of trying to get fresh water out of the Salt Sea. And they began working on desalinization ideas. So as you drive along the Salt Sea, you'll see these kind of secretive-looking plants set up and look like very, very interesting things they're doing there. But it has to do with desalinization. And I think they've figured it out. But if I were Israel, I wouldn't say anything.
Questions here, or else we can take them from during the break as well.
Since there was limestone there, doesn't that mean there are sinkholes there?
There are sinkholes? Yes, there are sinkholes in Israel, yes. And there are caves. You know, David lived in a cave for a while. And these would all have been limestone caves. And Lot lived in one for a while, didn't he? Now, those were the true cavemen. Just kidding.
question here.
Am I correct in believing that the Salt Sea is the lowest place on the face of the earth?
It is. It is. It's about, what is it, about 1,500 feet below sea level? So it's the lowest, and so is the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is the lowest freshwater lake in the world, and the Salt Sea is the lowest body of water in the world. Yeah. About 1,500 feet, I think it is, below sea level. And that's due to that rift. It's right in the middle of the Great Rift.
Okay, well, with that, we'll thank Patrick for answering those questions, and he'll be available to answer other questions you may have during the break. So let's give Patrick a hand and then take a break here. So if we could bring up the last slide there. The next speaker next month is yours truly. And I'm going to be actually speaking about 4 reasons why evolution is not good science. Remember that book I showed you? There's 77 reasons. And I'm going to look at 4 of the most important reasons why we as scientists do not consider evolution as good science. So, yeah, there you have it. So take a look at that if you're interested in that topic. Take a look at that book back there. Has a lot of details on that, and I will get into a little deeper on 4 specific things next month. And I want to remind you on the back table there, you can pick up flyers for if you're interested in the creation tours to Mount St. Helens or to the Scablands in the middle of Washington. Pick up a brochure in the back and call Ron and tell him that you're interested in doing that. The other thing, there are also flyers in the back table about the upcoming meetings. If you are, well, not from this church or any other, if you're from another church, then take one of those flyers and give it to your church leaders and see if they might put it in the church foyer to publicize some of these meetings that we have. And also there's a survey input on the back table. Take advantage of that if you have an interest in certain speakers coming here. And we're always open to help on certain areas in the forum. If you are interested in publicizing some of these events, let me know. We can put you to work doing that. If you want to help us build some of the content on the website, let me know. Social media, we do use Facebook and Twitter, and if you want to help with that, you're also welcome to help with that. So let me just close with that. Remind you of the ways that you can participate and let your friends and colleagues know about upcoming meetings. And of course, all that information is always available on our website. So thank you for your interest in apologetics and your support of this ministry. Let me just close in a word of prayer, and then in the back, take advantage of the display tables and also refreshments in the kitchen area. Father, we just come